Good morning. This morning I'll be reading from John 6:35 through 40. Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me and still do not believe. All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day."
Amen. Just looking up here at the stage, can you tell we're getting ready for Vacation Bible School next week? Looks really good, doesn't it? I know Les has been working very hard on this with a lot of volunteers, and if you haven't already registered your kids for VBS, would very much encourage you to do that. We're looking forward to next week. So I appreciated the reading that Barrett just did for us. As we get into this text today, I was actually thinking about King David. There's that one famous occasion where you have to wonder, could you have ever told David just how much trouble could come from looking out your window one day? That one time period where he decided that rather than going out to battle, and that was the thing he was known for, he was a mighty warrior. He was always out there with the troops, leading them into battle. It's part of why they were so loyal to him, because he really acted as one of them. He didn't act like he was above them. But on this one occasion, he got to thinking a little differently and said, I think just this time I'm going to stay back from battle and I'm going to hang out at my palace. And sure enough, he made his way up to the roof. And as he started surveying the place that he was ruling, he, of course, saw that woman, Bathsheba, taking a bath, bathing herself up on top of the roof. Somewhere, it must not have been too far away because he could see her clearly. And then he started letting some ideas bounce around in his head, and before you knew it, he made some choices that were really unfortunate, that had long repercussions in his life. Now, I think a lot of people in the world would probably tell you, well, there's no harm in looking. There's no harm in taking a peek or just giving it a little thought, but the real problem for David wasn't just the view. The problem for David was that combination of both desire and opportunity, wasn't it? There was a desire that was there, he fed that desire, and he found himself where he had opportunity to act on that desire and made a terrible decision. I'm confident he must have thought that encounter with Bathsheba was just like a one-night stand, just a one-time thing, something that would happen so he could say he did it, and then he would tell himself he'd never think about it again. But that's not how it worked out, was it? When we give in to our desires tug at us and they pull us around, and it does end up taking us in places we didn't want to go. Thinking about David and Bathsheba, thinking also about her husband Uriah, all the things that happened to him. I don't know if you've considered, but just that one falter, that one time he just gave in to his fleshly desires, made a really bad decision that he knew was wrong. Listen to this. Ultimately, it cost him 4 of his children. In relation to some of the events that spun out from this event, 4 of his children were killed. It led to his daughter's rape by his son. It led to a coup by his own children for his throne as they were fighting to take power. It meant that he wouldn't be allowed to build the temple, that thing we talked about a few weeks ago, the thing David had greatly desired in his heart to do. This is part of why David is not going to be permitted to build God's temple. He's a man of blood, because it did lead to the murder of Uriah the Hittite. He tried and tried to get Uriah to come back from the battlefield and go home to his wife and enjoy time with her. And Uriah said, I'm not going to be that person. When all my troops are out fighting on the front lines, I'm going to stand with my soldiers. It's not right for me to go home and have a vacation while all my companions are out there fighting. I want to be with them. I need to protect them and help them. So David sent him out to the front lines. And in fact, as he went out there, he was carrying in his hand his own death warrant with his new orders of where he was supposed to be. But David's effort to cover up his sin drove him to do something really terrible to Uriah. And of course, that child that Bathsheba conceived died right as it was born. So terrible, terrible consequences in David's life because of the way he gave into his desires. Now, the truth is, we all have desires, don't we? We all have different kinds of appetites, and most of these appetites, I would say probably all of these appetites to some degree, are not intrinsically anything that's wrong. We have an appetite for things that are fun. We like to do things that are enjoyable. The problem is when we let our appetites go unchecked, we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble, some really terrible kinds of trouble. So no harm in being a person who enjoys to have a little fun, but if the only thing you do in life is seek out pleasure and fun without thinking about the consequences, that takes you down some bad paths. We have that appetite for sexual fulfillment, and God has provided marriage through which that can be fulfilled. And in the context that God has given us, it's a good and beautiful thing. But when we look for other ways to fulfill that desire or let it go unchecked and just keep heading down that path, it does to us what it did to David. It takes us to some terrible places. The Apostle John in 1 John talks about the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, those things we have to be so careful about, the different lusts and desires that we have. That lust of the eyes, the tendency to look at things and tell yourself, man, I've got to have that. You see what someone else has and tell yourself, man, if I could have what they have, if I could own one of those, it's so new, it's so shiny, it's so much better than what I've already got. We give into the lust of the eyes. We're going to take ourselves to some places we're going to regret later. Then, of course, there's that lust of the flesh we've been talking about, where you just have these urges, and rather than learning to tame our urges and discipline ourselves to be people of self-control, if you give in to those urges, the lust of the flesh can take you to some bad places. And then there's what John calls the pride of life, or the arrogant life. And this is kind of the opposite of those other two, whereas opposed to me looking at everyone else, wishing I had what they have, instead, because of what I've got, I look at everyone else arrogantly and say, look how much better I am than they are just because of my stuff, or because of my talents, or because of the way that I look, or what people say about me. I was listening to a person at Lipscomb, and I cannot remember the speaker's name, but he was talking about this situation with David and Bathsheba, and I don't remember his name, but I remembered his 3 points, and I wanted to share them with you. He says, lust, your untamed desires, will take you farther than you planned to go. They will keep you longer than you planned to stay, and they will cost you more than you planned to pay. It's pretty good, isn't it? Your lust can take you farther than you planned to go, keep you longer than you planned to stay, and cost you more than you planned to pay. We could look at David's situation and know that that's true, isn't it? He never thought he was going to do the things that he did. David never thought he was going to murder an innocent man because of a cover-up for an affair. I know he never thought he would do anything like that. His lust took him a lot further than he planned to go. And certainly this ended up affecting all the rest of his life. He never would have thought what he hoped was like a one-time decision would have such long-standing repercussions. And look at the cost. The battles with his children, his family falling apart. So many bad things happened because of David and his untamed desires. And maybe not to the extent of David's experiences could you point to your own, but I think all of us could probably point to some situation in our life where I really knew the right thing to do. Instead, I chose to do the wrong thing, and I'm still paying for it. Whether it's literal or financial or even just in that voice in your head that always tells you, because of that flaw, because of that time you gave in, you're no longer worthy of this. You're no longer worthy to be loved by God. You don't really deserve to get to serve anymore because now you're that, because you did that thing. Those desires, when left unchecked, can have so many negative effects on us. When we are simply acting on our desires, we become really short-sighted, don't we? I believe it was the same speaker I was listening to who talked about how very often when you look at a person who's fishing, the fish is looking at the lure and the fish is thinking about breakfast, but the fisherman's thinking about lunch, right? And that's kind of how desires work for us. If we start giving in to whatever our urges are and our temptation is, we're thinking about breakfast. We're thinking about the treat. We're thinking about the snack. We're thinking about what is it that's going to make me feel really good right now in this moment. I don't want to have to think about the consequences. I don't want to have to think about later. But Satan is that lion who prowls around looking for whom he may devour. You're thinking about breakfast, but Satan is thinking about eating you for lunch. That's the way that desire and temptation works. When Satan can get that foothold and can convince you to believe one of his lies and go down that path, ultimately he might just eat your lunch. We've been, this is our second week in a new series we're doing on, we're calling it God is Greater. Really appreciated Mike's song selections this morning. We've been singing about the greatness of God. I think the song service has been really moving. And as we began last week, we talked about how for God to be greater, this is really for us a path to humility. So as we're talking about the greatness of God, this is actually for us a study of humility, putting God in his proper place and putting us in our proper place, and the way that that actually leads us to freedom and happiness. It's actually in self-denial and in putting others first and in putting God first that we find greater pleasure and greater joy and greater fulfillment. So last week we talked about the first step on this journey, which is to do everything with God in mind. To make God be number one in your life, in all things, in all places. So that's the first step. The second step that we're talking about today is our response to step number one. Because if God really is the number one thing in your life, that kind of requires some action on your part, doesn't it? If you're going to say that God is actually number one, there are some ways that we have to respond to that and to live that out. So it's a demanding thing. So the second principle, this step for this week we're going to talk about, is how important it is to learn to trust God's will more than our own. That God's will for me is actually better than my will for myself. We have so many things that distract us and throw us off course. Our bodies are just full of impulses and distractions. And as we've already talked about, whatever these urges are that we have, any urge, if left unchecked, if not treated with self-control, is something that can be destructive for us. It's actually a dangerous thing to always do what feels good. It can be a deadly thing to believe that whatever happens in secret or in Vegas will just stay there, right? Things that are secret are not going to remain secret. It's very perilous to believe that one deliberate moral slip, this wrong thing I'm going to do on purpose, it's dangerous to believe that it's not going to have consequences. I think this statement sums it up well. Our will is the product of our wants. Why should you sometimes distrust your own will? Because your will is usually comprised of all those things that you've spent your time wanting. Our wants are insatiable, are they not? I mean, I could ask you to raise your hands. How many of you in your life have enough money? Does anybody ever think we've got enough of that? Because there's always the possibility of plus something to whatever you've got. It's math, right? Whoever has enough money. Could any of you look at me right now and say, you know, in my life, I have been so privileged here in the United States. I have had so many good meals that for the rest of my life, I'm content to only eat like bread and rice. I've had enough good food. Who's ever had enough good food? You always want more, don't you? What about enough good experiences, good memories, good times? Whoever really has enough of those things? But those wants that we have drive us and can produce what our will becomes. And so the will is that force that drives you towards action. So what is it that's moving you towards action? As Christians, when we're giving our lives to Christ, we're trying to let God's love be the thing that animates us. And if we're allowing it to be our will that animates us, we're going to keep ending up back in those same places because our desires are much more strong than most of us want to admit. I wanted to look with you in Romans chapter 7. In Romans chapter 7, Paul plays out this internal struggle, and I personally find this, even though it's kind of a negative passage, I find it encouraging because I would look at the Apostle Paul as one of my heroes, wouldn't you? I mean, I wish I could have his courage. I wish I could have his ability to teach and speak and all the things he was capable of. So I think most of us would look at Paul as a hero, and it's encouraging to me that Paul shares the struggles that I'm convinced all of us have. He says in verse 18, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Now, if you know Romans well, you know Romans 8 is where it starts getting really happy, right? Romans 8 kind of cheers you up from Romans 7, but before we get too urgent to move on to the happy part, we actually need to let this passage sink in a little bit. Paul himself certainly understood what it was like to be a person who really wanted to do good but to struggle with it. We're all that way. Can you relate to what he said? I want to do the right thing, but it seems like even when I try to do the right thing, evil's so close by. I do the good thing, and then I have some of those voices in my head that are really some questionable motives for why it is I'm doing the right thing. I just want to be a good person. I lay there on bed in the morning, and I'm thinking about the good person that I'm going to be, and I just fail at doing it sometimes. I have great intentions, and I don't follow through on those intentions. I want to do great things, but I just start chasing shiny things and squirrels and distracting things. And why is it that I can't stay focused to be this person that God wants me to be? Paul understands that, doesn't he? He talks about this war within his body where I have that spiritual mind I'm trying to listen to, but inside of me there's still all those, even with my best intentions, there's all those desires that pull at me so hard. So for Christians, humility becomes so important. Humility for us can serve as a compass. If you're not sure where to go in any situation, if you're trying to figure out what Jesus would do, Jesus was a humble person. So in any situation, just ask yourself, what can I do right now that would make God be greater and make me be of less importance to myself? Not that you don't matter, not that you devalue yourself, but to say that you value God more than you value anything else. Do you understand that you were created to fulfill a design that can only be discovered by overcoming your own cravings? I want to say that again. Do you understand that you were created to fulfill a design that can only be discovered by overcoming your own cravings? As a Christian, the person that God is trying to make you into, you can really only fully grasp when you get past this constant need to satiate your every desire. As long as you stay in that mindset of just chasing after what feels good or doing what immediately feels best for you, you're not even really going to discover the person that God is intending for you to be. In order to become that person, to fulfill that design that God has in mind for you, you're going to have to get past these constant cravings and chasing after all the things that toss us about in life. Because the function of our lives is not just to serve ourselves, is it? The function of our lives is to serve God, because if I only live to serve myself, it's a pretty small cause to support. There's not a lot of significance to me beyond myself. And if I'm only living for myself, I'm going to live my life for something that's really small and petty. But to live for God lets us tie ourselves into something that's much larger and of much greater significance. We can all model ourselves after Jesus' own behavior. I'm going to come back to John chapter 6 here, and I'm not going to reread the whole passage, but I think there's a lot of wisdom from Jesus and how it is that we set our compass towards humility and let that guide us in our actions. In John chapter 6, what's been going on is that people have started arguing with Jesus, and most immediately before this passage, they were demanding for him to show them some kind of a sign. That's what they tell Jesus. Show us some kind of sign of your importance. Show us why it is that we should pay attention to you or listen to you. Isn't it the case that so many of the things that distract us are our own efforts to put up signs of our own greatness? Do we not do that? By the things that we work so hard to purchase for ourselves or dress ourselves with, or abilities that we try to cultivate. Don't we do those things because we're trying to put up signs of our own greatness, the very thing that they were tempting Jesus to do? Put up a sign and show us how great you are. A lot of us spend an awful lot of energy trying to do that. So Jesus begins his statements by pointing out and saying that he is the breath of life. The specific claim he makes is, anyone, who eats the bread of life, if you come to me and you trust me, you're never going to be hungry again, and you're never going to be thirsty again. So not that we don't have cravings, not that we don't have things that we've chased after, but the difference between Jesus and everything else in your life is that anything else you turn to for an ultimate sense of fulfillment is going to leave you hungry again at some point. Your favorite hobby at some point is going to get boring to you when there's nowhere else to go with it. The nicest thing that you can possibly purchase is not going to seem that valuable when you see someone else has one that's a little bit nicer than yours. Whatever it is we would use to define ourselves normally is going to leave us dissatisfied. But in finding our fulfillment in Jesus, the bread of life, we could spend our whole life trying to embody the teachings of Jesus and find ourselves only more full, more fulfilled because of that journey than anything else we would chase after. When you come to Jesus for your sustenance, he doesn't turn you away hungry or leave you empty. Jesus says, I have come, and he says one of the reasons he's come is to do the will of him who sent me. Jesus models for us what it means to put God first in all things. Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, as Philippians tells us, but instead he emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, and he humbled himself even further to the point of death on a cross. Jesus truly said and meant, I am only here to do the will of the one who sent me. We could all say, we are only here to do the will of the one who created us and now has sent us into the world to fulfill his great commission. He came from heaven and we come from wherever we come from, but we can all know why we're here, to do the will of the one who sent us. Related to this passage, I was reminded of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 4, which to me is a tough passage. The writer of Hebrews says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And tie that into David's situation. In resisting sin and fighting against sin in your life, the critique is you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. The image you should have in your head is the thing you're tempted to do wrong, have you resisted it so much that the only way anyone could get you or force you to do it would have to involve making you bleed somehow? Are you resisting temptation that strongly? And perhaps a more positive spin we could put on that idea is in your life, in the way you've tried to live out the Great Commission, in the ways that you've tried to serve God, have you got the scars from your service to prove that you've been serving? I've heard stories of people who, you get a little cut on your hand from going out and serving the people you're serving. Maybe you got a ding on your bumper because you were taking something and delivering something to someone who needed it, and someone happened to nick your car on the way. You get scars based on whatever it is you're doing with your life. But in your own life, have you struggled against sin? Have you resisted to the point of shedding your blood? That's a tall order, but that is the level to which Jesus committed himself to this mission, to putting God's will first in all things. That I will do this to the exclusion of everything else, to the point that I'm quite willing, capable of shedding my blood for this cause. Jesus also says that he had come that he should lose nothing of all that God had given him. I've come that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me. This was for Jesus a reflection on the church and those who would be faithful to him, that those who are in him are going to be saved and don't have to worry. But I would ask the question, what is it that is within your control? Jesus was not going to lose the things that were given to him, but what is it that God has given to you? What are the things that God has given to you within your possession, within your control, and are you using those things for God? What about the people who are within your influence? Your possessions, your home, your vehicles, your friendships, your relationships, are you claiming those for God so that God can work through those, so that none of those efforts, none of those opportunities are going to be lost? Jesus says, I'm not going to miss one of my little ones. I'm not going to lose something that God has entrusted to me. So an important question to ask is, what is it that God has entrusted to you? What is within your sphere of influence? What is within your household and your control that you could be doing something with and something for? Another thing that Jesus says is that he has come that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life. He says, I've come that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life. Now, on the one hand, it is a true statement to say that life is complicated, isn't it? Life is just difficult. Lots of things don't go the way we intend for them to go. Life is complicated, but I would argue the purpose of life is remarkably uncomplicated. If you're a Christian and you understand why you're here, to put God first, to serve Jesus in all things, it might be hard to do it, but understanding what it is you're supposed to do is quite a bit less complicated. It's actually fairly simple to look toward Jesus in every situation, knowing that the more people we can point to Jesus, the more people there are who are going to be saved, to receive eternal life. So in this struggle, this journey, and again, I find a lot of encouragement in Paul, who very much gets the ideals we're talking about, but also gets just how hard it is to live those out. I was thinking about the way that so many conversations go with people about Christianity, because the claim people like to make about Christianity is that Jesus was wrong about that whole bread of life, living water thing. That we know Christianity's kind of neat and church is kind of okay, but ultimately I think I'm just going to want to do something else. I don't think it's really going to fulfill me. And Jesus' promise is, if you really come to me and really taste and drink and see, you're not going to be hungry again. But the way people like to talk about our faith is to say that, well, Christianity is kind of interesting, but I found it lacking. I would contend that the problem with our faith is not that it's lacking, but instead when people find it, what they find is that it's actually difficult to do, and therefore they don't even really try it. A lot of people have looked at our faith and then rather than tried it and found it didn't work, they just won't really give it a shot. Our temptation is to not really give Jesus the priority that he's asking for, to not really trust him enough to make those efforts that he's calling on us for. So as I was reflecting on this passage, I don't know why, but I started thinking about the old Dr. Seuss book, Green Eggs and Ham. There was that whole thing about, if I could just get you to taste this, I really think you would like it. Would you just try it? And the whole book is about this persistent conversation between Sam I Am and his buddy. And his buddy says, I don't like green eggs and ham. And he says, how do you know you don't like green eggs and ham if you've never tried them? He said, well, I don't think I like them. And so there's that whole, entertaining conversation. And I thought of the way that Sam I Am was such a good evangelist for green eggs and ham. And I was wondering to myself, what would have happened if we could make Sam I Am into an evangelist? What if he was preaching the gospel instead? So indulge me, I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this for just a minute. I was thinking, what if it was the great I am that Sam I Am was promoting so hard? He would say, the great I am, would you serve the great I am? I don't want to serve the great I am. I do not want to, Sam I Am. I have preferences, you see, the way I want my life to be. Would you serve him in your house? I would not serve him in my house. I want my own way in my house and with my kids and with my spouse. I can't share Jesus at my work since people know me as a jerk. I want my own way here and there to get what I want everywhere. I want more stuff from near and far, bigger trucks and faster cars. It's all about me here and there. I want to be first everywhere. It's inconvenient for me for God to have his way, you see. It simply doesn't fit my plan to humbly serve the great I am. All right, so that might have been the way that conversation would play out. Thank you. I appreciate that, yeah. I don't even want to tell you how much time I put into that. But thinking about that concept, if you would just taste it, if we could go to that next slide, the way the book ends is he finally gives it a taste and says, wow, this is wonderful. Why have I been denying myself this all this time? So in your own life, it's not possible to change all aspects of yourself in one moment or overnight or even in a week's time, is it? You spent your whole life becoming the way that you are. So, you've got your impulses, you've got your habits, you've got your possessions, you've got your speech. There's a lot of different things you have, your relationships. But what if you were to actually try putting God's way first in one of those areas? So I'm not asking you to try and transform everything about yourself immediately, though I think God can do big and amazing things when we give him space to work. But what if you really did seriously give God a little extra try, more so than what you've been doing? And if you can't fix everything, what's one area that you actually would take a step in? Maybe you would just commit yourself that with your coworkers, you've been a jerk to some people, and maybe there's some things you need to apologize for. What if you actually just did that? Just put your ego in check and said, God is greater. I don't need to matter so much. I'm going to go ahead and say I'm sorry for the things I shouldn't have done. Would you take that step? Taste it and see how it is. What if you actually carved out some more time in your morning to pray before you just launch into checking social media or doing all your routines or just jumping onto the office tasks? What if you took just a few extra minutes to pray and to ask God to show you what it is that he wants you to do today, just today, not worried about tomorrow, not worried about next week, but what opportunities do I have in front of me right now? If you would just give God a little extra taste, if you would give him just a little bit extra room, I think just like Sam I Am's friend, I think we all might find that the more we give to God space to work in our lives, the more we submit to him in our wills, the more we trust his will more than we trust our will, I think we do end up in a place that's so much more satisfying, that does resemble all the things that Jesus promises, that we are going to come up full and not hungry, that we're going to come up fulfilled and not without purpose. So this morning, this is an invitation to all of us. Can you find that extra space in your life to commit to the Lord? And would you give him just a little more room? Take that one extra step. And maybe this morning you are a person who's got something that's weighing on your heart, and maybe we have some people here this morning that would like some special time of prayer, or you want to just commit your life to Jesus in baptism, or something else that you just need to do. But this is our opportunity that we've set aside for responses. So if you'd like to respond this morning, we would invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.